Welcome back to another edition of What Really Matters. I'm Gary Sutton. I'm with Charlie Giroux, who's running for governor here in the state of Pennsylvania. Just recently we had the Ides of March, and anybody that remembers Caesar remembers Ides of March didn't turn out too well for him. That was the 15th of March back at like 44 BC. And, you know, one of the interesting things about the Ides of March was the idea that Caesar was told by a seer that he should beware the Ides of March. Well, he was on the way to the Senate that day, and he went by this same seer and said to the seer, hey, it's the Ides of March and things are still okay. He says, aye, it's the Ides of March, but the day's not over yet. You know, Caesar was stabbed to death that day by the senators, and it was because he had tried to gain too much power and upset the Roman Republic. We've got a lot of people now in this idea of power, and that's what we're talking about today, this word power, that have really kind of gone past the idea of a republic called the United States of America, and they're trying to gain power for the sake of gaining power, trying to do things that seem to be rather selfish rather than humble. You and I have talked a lot about that in our series so far. Let's talk a little bit about power and how you view power as a gubernatorial candidate, but also as a citizen of the state of Pennsylvania as well.
Well, it took 23 mortal wounds for Caesar to be put out of his misery and the people of the Republic put out of theirs. But in all seriousness, Gary, we hear the old saying that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there's a lot of truth to that. When you are vested with power, it can be a very good thing, used properly, or it can be a very bad thing and a very insidious thing. And unfortunately, there are too many people in the public arena right now that want power for the sake of power. And that's troubling and really, in many respects, disturbing. Because the power of our republic, and the founders created it this way, always came from the people. Mm-hmm. The people are the ones who truly possess the power. And they invest representatives, underlying representatives, to represent them for a short period of time, and in my judgment, then go back and live with what they did. Or they invest in executive, in the case of a governor, with the ability to do certain things, but ultimately it's about protecting their power rather than accumulating it for him or herself.
Talk about power as you're running, because power is the great aphrodisiac. I mean, you look at power, and we've seen people who went in, that were good people, had good intentions, and they walked in and they burned the bridge into caucusdom if they were in the legislature, or maybe they forgot about the people if they were the governor, and they went off and started thinking that they knew a lot better than the people. How's Charlie Giroux think about power as you're running your campaign right now and, you know, potentially a governor in the state of Pennsylvania?
Well, I realize that Henry Kissinger's words that you just quoted are true, but it's also a great elixir to the person that holds power.
Right.
And that's the place where it's a real problem. So I pray for one thing every morning, and I mean this sincerely, and that's humility. Because I think if you have humility, the quest for power is properly placed. And then you want to use the power that's given to you by the people for their benefit rather than for your own. And I think that's really where the rubber meets the road for a lot of people, is what's your true motivation? Is your true motivation to be a public servant and serve the public in a servant role? Or is it something else? Is it about self-aggrandizement? Is it an ego trip? Is it something you want for yourself? Because unfortunately, there are too many that have run for public office where that's the case, rather than being real public servants.
You just said something that I think is so important for all of us to remember. You said the power given to them by the people. A lot of people are feeling right now like it's the power that has been snatched from them by people who are serving as their representatives, who actually are not saying, we're not representatives, we are the government. And when we talk about the government right now, we talk about they instead of we. I think that's an important relationship that you just kind of alluded to.
There has grown up, Gary, a elite class, a ruling class, not only in Washington, D.C., but sadly here in Pennsylvania as well, that has not served our interests very well. And that's what people are reacting against. They don't want the elites to tell them what to do. They don't want a bunch of experts telling them how to live their lives. They believe in individual liberty, in personal freedom, in the ability to make decisions for themselves and decide for themselves what's best for them, what's best for their families, how their hopes and dreams and ambitions are best realized and best accomplished, rather than having some expert in government telling them what to do, watching over them to make sure they do it, and lording it over them if they don't.
You know, we talk about power, and a lot of people want the power right now to pay their bills. A lot of people want the power right now to make the choices about where their kids are going to go to school. A lot of people want the power right now to be able to do things. And the way that power is done is when people are allowed to have more freedom and more liberty. How does Charlie Giroux plan on getting more freedom and more liberty available for those people who give you the power to act on their behalf?
Well, you're exactly right, Gary. And you say, people want more spending power, for
Right.
example. Well, that means lower taxes.
Right.
Because if the government, state government and federal government, isn't taking more out of your pocket every day, it means that you're keeping more of your hard-earned dollars and deciding for yourself and for your family how those dollars, hard-earned dollars, are best spent. To me, that's a much, much better way of doing things than having the government grabbing constantly more and more and more and more. And I think it also goes to the leadership we talked about just a moment ago. Pardon me, where the executive and the legislature are there to protect the liberties of the people and to protect their safety and their freedom. And then I think you've got what people are really looking for, because we do have too many people taking power, grabbing it away from individual citizens in the name of big government and the elites and the ruling class and the so-called experts.
Public service. You talked about the word humility a few minutes ago, and humbleness goes along with that. But we don't sense today that leadership is necessarily that humble that often. You're offering a humble type of leadership right now, which allows people to have more of that freedom. It's hard for those who are not humble to trust those poor people like us out there that pay the bills and send them the money each day, and yet at the same time, it's necessary in a nation that espouses liberty and freedom, and a state that espouses liberty and freedom.
Right, and I believe in humility. And Gary, it's really hard to be humble when you're as wonderful as I am. But I hope everybody knows. I hope everybody knows I'm joking.
Yeah.
But I really do believe that humility is at the core of good leadership. And you look at the great leaders of our time and of our country. George Washington, incredibly humble, walked away from being president of the United States. He could have been the king of the United States.
Right.
He literally could have been the king of the United States. And frankly, that's what people were used to. And he said, no, we're going to have something very, very different. I'm walking away from this, something he could have kept. And that, I think, is exactly where we need to be today, where people don't want the title, where they want to do a job, where they want to serve the people rather than aggrandize themselves. I have a title. I have the ability to tell you what to do. I can lock down, shut down, mandate, edict, and all this stuff that we've seen over the course of the past few years.
We watched a lot of power accumulated during COVID. We watched the governor in the state of Pennsylvania use a lot of power for a long period of time. We're reminded that we have a constitutional, a supreme law of our land in the nation, a supreme law of our land here in the state of Pennsylvania. We have one here too. And that we ought to play by the rules of those Constitution and the spirit of the Constitution. Sometimes we stretch this thing out as far as we can go. We get that broad interpretation, narrow interpretation, all that kind of thing. My point is that I think people want to get back to playing by the rules again, and that's the kind of power they want to see, where power respects the rules and deals in truth for the best interest of the people.
You bet, Gary. And look what happened when Tom Wolf overreached, tried to accumulate too much power to himself. The people reacted and are still reacting, but they passed 2 constitutional amendments that would limit the power of a governor in an emergency situation. And I want to have a 3rd constitutional amendment, Gary, which would allow the people of Pennsylvania, all of us, the right to recall and remove from office any governor that thinks he or she is a king, because we the people rule here, and it has to be that way.
One of the things that power also ought to be twinned with is wisdom. The idea that, and I know it says in our Commonwealth Constitution, talks about the idea when people see bad government, they should have a right to replace it. It says that also in our national Constitution as well. And you're talking about not just by an election, but before that time. Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I've talked about the recall and removal of any governor that thinks that he or she is a king. That ought to go to other offices as well. But I believe in ballot initiatives where people, we the people, would be allowed to introduce legislative matters through referendum when the legislature doesn't do its job. I'll give you a prime example. A lot of candidates are talking about business taxes, Gary, and how awful our business tax structure is in Pennsylvania. Even Tom Wolf in a fit of lucidity, said our business taxes are too high. And they are. They make us non-competitive, not less competitive, but non-competitive with other states. They ought to be dramatically reduced. And yet you've got a governor that says we should do it, a legislature that says we should do it, and what has happened over the course of the last quarter of a century?
Yeah.
Nothing. And so I want to be a governor that will put his shoulder to the wheel and will tell the legislature, put up or shut up. Make your actions match your words. And that's what people are looking for. They just want to see the results because actions speak so much more loudly than words. And unfortunately, the politics of Pennsylvania is filled with a lot of words and not so much action. So we want to see us get to work and get the job done.
One of the powers that we'd like to see also exercised, I think, is the power of accountability and the power of making sure that you understand and respect the money coming to you like it's your own. And we don't sense that right now here in the state of Pennsylvania, dare say around the world, but around the country. But at least here in Pennsylvania right now, that's being respected as well as it should be by the governor. We're throwing this amount of money at this and this amount of money, and there's no accountability. We don't know if that group is doing a good job the year before or not. We need to get away from this idea of what our political interests are and what are in the best interests of Pennsylvania. Your thoughts about that?
Well, Gary, there's a sad expression up under the dome in Harrisburg about OPM, other people's money.
Yeah.
And that really is what it's all about. They say it in a very cynical and snide way.
Right.
But the rest of us say it very, very seriously. It is our money. Government doesn't have any money.
Nope.
It's only what they take from you and me and all of our friends. And so the state government as well as the national government really have an incredible responsibility to use those dollars wisely and well, frankly, to take less of them at the start. But what they do get to use them as if they were their own. But unfortunately, there's this really snide and cynical attitude. Well, it's other people's money, and we can do with it kind of what we want. And that's why we don't have the bang for the buck that we should be getting.
Right.
We don't have the benefits that we should be getting. As you know, I was the state chairman of Citizens Against Government Waste for many years. And one of the nicest things that was ever said about me in that role was J. Peter Grace, who headed the Grace Commission for President Reagan. He said, Charlie sniffed out government waste like a bloodhound and fought it like a bulldog. And I remember him saying that, and I have enjoyed remembering that because that's what we've got to do. We've got to look at where the waste, fraud, and mismanagement exists because folks thought it was simply other people's money. And we've got to eliminate it. We've got to make sure that every dollar is spent as though it was our own and as though it were our own last dollar.
Well, and at the very best, taxation is legal plunder, as Frederick Bastiat said, Walter Williams later on. Bastiat said that in 1847, when he said it's legal plunder. So you're taking from people, but you ought to take less, not more.
Right.
And this idea that you take this and you're going, and one of the words that chafes at I think a lot of citizens today, we're going to invest this for you. I'll invest for myself, thank you very much. I don't need you to invest for me. Your thoughts on that?
Well, government doesn't have any money to invest.
No.
Again, it's our money, and government doesn't invest, they spend.
Right.
I think that's important. They've tried to change the language because people are tired of high spending. But I got to tell you, Gary, I have none of my neighbors running up to me telling me that my life would be just a little bit better
Right.
if only my taxes were higher.
Yeah.
So people understand what it means to have their dollars being taken when they work so hard for them. Got up at 5, 6, 6:30 in the morning, went to work, spent a hard day working, came home tired and maybe even a little irritable, and then saw their paycheck with gigantic chunks
Right.
chopped out
Right.
to go somewhere else. And I think that folks really are focused on the fact that they ought to be keeping more of those hard-earned dollars.
Power has to get back to for the people, from the people, and that's what you're talking about in this campaign. And of course, you could talk with people as well because they can give you a call.
They can. 877-8194. That's the 717 area
As
code, by
always.
the way. 717-877-8194. I really will take the calls. That's my personal cell number. And I do want to hear from people, whether it's to yell and scream about something or to offer me an idea that we may not have thought about. I want to hear what's important to you and what your future ambitions, hopes, dreams, expectations are, and how we can best help make them a reality.
Charlie Giroux's running for governor, and remember, the power is from the people, not done to the people. I'm Gary Sutton. What really matters? We'll talk to you next time.
Businessman, conservative, patriot, Charlie Giroux for governor.